Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and this will be part 2 in this short series, Ancient Alchemy, the Legends of Miners and Metalworkers, which would connect to ancient alchemy even up until the medieval, early Renaissance period, and up until that point when alchemy was officially turned into what is now referred to as chemistry. But the alchemists were chemists, and metallurgy, glass making, dyes and colours and these other aspects was part of the alchemical craft. Much has been attached to it in regards to the philosophy, but there is hard science and very advanced science in regards to these alchemists, and so we'll be looking at arsenic and copper. So we have a bit of a map there. Okay, so Egyptian metalworkers or metallurgists, alchemists, and so we see there's an old image of them. But the Egyptian metalworking god, the god of the craftsman, Ptah, are connected with dwarves and with green skin. This will be a common feature. So this is a sarcophagus lid of Jeho, and there we can see that he's clearly not short, but a dwarf by the legs and the skull, etc. Also, he's been connected with the Apis bull in this in Saqqara, but that's a separate thing. But I'll link these papers, of course, in the description. But the dwarves achieved high rank, especially during the Old Kingdom, and even from the tomb of Merauke, but again at Saqqara, where we can see dwarves working as goldsmiths. So this will be a connection across much of the ancient world. From the tomb of Tutankhamun, we can see a dwarf female, and an interesting point is that she also has club feet. Her feet have been twisted. The interesting point is the attitudes of the ancient Egyptian to people such as dwarves. Now, famously the Spartans, but also the Greeks, would inspect their children at birth, and any defect they would abandon their children, as were the Egyptians, and also the Romans had a very different outlook in regards to not only dwarfism, but even things like autism and Down syndrome, those type of conditions. The Egyptians and the Romans were much more embracing of these particular figures. So Ptah, god of craftsmen or metalworkers, the green skin and the dwarf connection. So when ancient writers such as Herodotus or Strabo visit Egypt, I'll describe, so when he visits Memphis, he talks about the temple of Hephaestus. Well, Hephaestus is Ptah, and he describes the statue in this temple of Hephaestus or Ptah is the likeness of a dwarf. So Hephaestus is the Greek equivalent of Ptah, the god of craftsmen and metalworking. So from Egypt, we'll look at Greece and Rome. Hephaestus, god of fire, god of metalworking to the Greeks, known as Vulcan to the Romans. Now you'll notice both of them are lame, and there as well. While in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, we have the dwarf smiths such as Broca, also Wayland, and again notice the club foot. This is another image of Wayland from Northumbria in England on the 8th century casket. Now the image probably doesn't, but the sagas in regards to this describe him as being hamstrung. This will be an important feature. So we're from Greece, Egypt, Greece, Rome, up into Scandinavia and beyond. These images and these stories actually convey some very interesting information. Metalworkers were dwarfed, they're lame, or they're green-skinned. And one of the ways to best understand this is to first look at the famous Ötzi the Iceman, who was found on the Italian Austrian border, frozen in a glacier. Very interesting, especially in regards to the materials he was using. For instance, his bow, his knife handles, etc. were of a different type of wood, and again shows a very high level of understanding. For instance, a different type of timber has different types of properties, and he just happened to use exactly the right timber to make an axe handle, knife handle, or to make his bow. Again, that these ancient people had a much better understanding of materials in that regard. So this is his copper axe. Again, the handle, was it ash or yew? Now, but chose a very good one, but it was attached to this copper axe. And I'll put an asterisk next to copper because this is an important detail. Ötzi's copper axe is not the copper you're used to seeing. So when people now think of copper, they think of copper wire or copper piping. This is not what Ötzi was holding. His copper axe is not actually copper. And so comparing these modern materials to ancient materials, big problem. Modern archaeological reconstructions, experimentation, such as sawing with copper tools or using copper chisels, well, I'll link again in the description, but what these, air quotes, ancient tool experts use is pure modern copper. They basically get scrap copper piping and wire, they melt it down, and then they cast it. This is not accurate. Modern copper, such as wires and pipes, are 99.9% pure copper. This is a very modern thing. This is not equivalent to the ancient material, which just gets referred to as soft copper by most. There was the Egyptian job, National Geographic. So they used copper chisels to split pieces of granite. And it was actually successful. So just like the feather and wedge technique, where you can split big blocks of stone in minutes. It doesn't take hours or years. You can literally can be done in minutes. There's plenty of examples of people using that technique to split granite and other materials. But they approached a blacksmith to make this chisel for them. The blacksmith said, "You don't want pure copper. What you want is a copper alloy." And well, they insisted, and so he just melted down copper pipes and made pure copper chisels. So they look ancienty, but they're not relevant. But again, this is a thing that happens. Now, I'll link this video I did a while back. I'll go into some of these details. For instance, the reconstruction experiment to make the Sphinx's nose, and the massive, big issues in regards to the tool experts, the way that they were operating and the materials they were using. It's not good, and also these are often cited by critics / doubters, and again, these criticisms are not very good, to be blunt, but they'll be in the description. So Ötzi's copper axe, 99.7% pure copper. You'd think, oh well, that's good, they got really close to being pure, but this is a very important point. It's only a fraction of a percent difference between pure copper, but this makes a massive difference, this percentage. And so they've analyzed his copper axe, and they found that 99.7% pure, and of the impurities, 70% of those impurities is arsenic. That's very important, very important, because what we have now is not a copper axe. What we have is an arsenical copper axe. Very important difference. It's essentially a different material. It's not copper, it's arsenical copper, and depending on the definition, this is arsenical. It's bronze, essentially. This has to do with the ancient secrets of alchemy and metalworking. So we go back and look at those comparisons. Lame gods, dwarf gods, also metalworking would be connected with mining, and how this has spread. So when you most often hear Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, these terms, again, are very simplified, but they can also be very misleading. So firstly, what is bronze? So we go down here to Cyprus. Cyprus comes from the word copper. This was a very important place of copper production and trade around the world. And so there we see Cyprus, and this is the Uluburun shipwreck, and that's where the location was. And the artifacts on there show that there was a trade route, at least it actually extends much further, but what we have is a trade route through Egypt, also there, trading with the Mesopotamian area, also up into Greece. And what's interesting about this particular shipwreck is that, for instance, there was ingots of copper and tin on the ship, these, as they call them, oxhide, There was also this ancient glass, which both for Mesopotamians and Old Kingdom, very, very old Egyptians were making faience glass, which is an important feature. So, but what's very interesting about that shipwreck is that for every 10 ingots of copper, there was 1 ingot of tin. This creates a very good recipe, the ingredients you need to make bronze. And when most people, and when we think of bronze, unlike iron or copper, which comes like is an element naturally in just an element, bronze is not an element. Bronze is an alloy of copper. Now, one of those alloys of copper that make bronze is copper plus tin. 10 parts copper plus 1 part tin would make a very good bronze, and so bronze swords and the Bronze Age, approximately, well, not a porks, but approximately 10% tin mixed with copper, that is a bronze we'd be most familiar with, most people would think of. However, before the copper tin bronze was being made and is associated with the Copper Age, arsenical copper, which is also referred to as arsenical bronze, was being used in the ancient times, very ancient times. Prior to the Bronze Age, they were not making pure copper instruments, tools, weapons. This just did not happen. So you'll often hear Stone Age, Bronze Age, and then Iron Age. Well, some would, not very often, but those would refer to something as called the Copper Age, which would overlap with the early Bronze Age. This is also misleading by, but not deliberately, but without the details, because actually the Copper Age, as it's sometimes referred to, should be really called the Arsenical Copper or the Arsenical Bronze Age. Very important feature. People in the past were not using pure copper. So on a go, back to the Uluburun shipwreck, where we have this glass, which was being traded again across the ancient world, and these ingots of copper and tin. So just to get this out of the way, Mohs hardness scale, this is often used and cited, and there are big issues with it because, so we see the mineral names but common objects. So steel, a steel nail or a hardened steel, we have grades, and then we come down to copper, where copper would be about 3.5 on the Mohs hardness scale. This is used to cite evidence that a certain material cannot work another certain material. This is entirely wrong to use Mohs hardness scale in regards to this aspect. What Mohs hardness scale is what mineral will scratch another mineral. So if you want to polish stone, or as an abrasive, so use a powder to make a drill, and that is an appropriate use of Mohs hardness scale. But when it comes to chisels and hammers and these aspects, it's just way off. Now, it's often cited the conundrum, etc., or diamond being 10 on Mohs hardness scale, and then glass, like your window glass or your drinking glass, on Mohs hardness scale has the equivalent hardness of cutlery, so your knives and forks have the same hardness as glass. This is not spoken of, and no one ever said, make me a glass chisel. A glass chisel is not equivalent to a steel knife or any, even mild steel. They're both the same hardness, but making a tool not even close to equivalent. It's as where the ancient crushed quartz of faience glass is mainly quartz, and that would put it up to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Now, even with that glass, I'm not going to make a chisel or a hammer out of it. It's just not going to happen. So again, these 99% pure copper chisels which they use, well, that will be a problem on its own. However, you'll notice that it's often said that it won't cut. Now, even the word cut is not appropriate. Whether you're using a steel or a bronze or a copper chisel, you don't cut steel, you shatter steel. You break up, you don't cut stone, you shatter stone. As where a wood chisel cuts through the fibers of the timber, steel chisels break and shatter the stone. Cutting is not an appropriate term to be using in that aspect. So a knife, your type of knife or fork that the steel used in there is equivalent to of Mohs hardness to window glass, while the ancient glass from crushed quartz is even harder than that. It's equivalent to harder than a steel nail, much harder than copper. But Mohs hardness scale never should be used to judge what material works in regards to another when it comes to copper, to hammers and chisels, to polishing stone, or to using a powder to help in drilling stone. That would be appropriate. If the way that Mohs hardness scale is used to judge that copper cannot, for instance, work limestone, if that was correct, then you would be making hammers and chisels from glass, and does not happen. It is cringe, it is double face palm, it is really bad. Now, as an example, take a bronze hammer, which on Mohs hardness scale would be soft, and hit a priceless diamond with it. You're going to have a big bill in front. You won't be replacing the bronze hammer, you'll be replacing the value of the diamond. Don't do it. It just doesn't work. So glass is harder than copper, even window glass. No one, unless for artistic purposes, ever makes a glass chisel or a glass hammer. It just doesn't happen. Granite is hard because of so again, stone shouldn't be is not appropriate to be using. It's the minerals that make up the stone that give it the various grading on Mohs hardness scale. But stone, such as granite, it shatters. Just like if you were to hit a diamond, which is 10. Technically, diamond is the hardest material, but again, hit diamond with a much softer hammer, steel or bronze or or whatever. The diamond will shatter. Diamond, stone, quartz, glass will shatter. It's not the hardness on Mohs hardness scale that counts when it in regards to working material to another. It's the composition of the material that it would be a more appropriate use of that. Now, for instance, you'll often hear, and I get countless comments on other videos just parroting the same old thing. But so here in Sydney we have a lot of sandstone, and some of it is so soft you can crush it in your hand. You can see that this sandstone is very quickly eroded. So the comparison between volcanic stone such as granite compared to sedimentary stone such as sandstone, again, not an equivalent, because sarsen stone, for instance at Stonehenge, is a sandstone essentially. This very soft sandstone here in the Sydney Basin is also a sandstone, and they both have the same hardness on Mohs scale. One of them is very tough to work. Sarsen is like trying to work with granite. It is really, really tough, but it has essentially exactly the same Mohs hardness as this very weak, very easily worked and eroded sandstone. Again, Mohs hardness scale just really shouldn't be used. It's not proper at all. But back to the Uluburun shipwreck, where we saw that ancient Egyptian green or blue glass, which was also used in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, what's interesting is that these glass beads were found up in Denmark in a grave that's 3,500 years old. So this is interesting evidence of trade routes linking the Mediterranean with Northern Europe, just as we see the similarity in their gods and their legends there. Also, these are carvings from Sweden, but they're showing Mediterranean or triremes, these ancient ships, and they're suggesting this was an inspiration for the later famous so-called Viking longships. But what they found were these Swedish axes were made from copper from Cyprus. Cyprus is copper, and this goes back again very long time, at least 3,600 years old. So just like the Uluburun shipwreck, where we saw was doing a trade route in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, but again we're finding trade goods going way up into Northern Europe, and most likely because of the shipping and because of that this was done by sea. There could have been overland trade as well, but very, very strong evidence for these trade routes by sea. So in regards to, back to arsenical copper, and consider the so-called Iron Age. Well, iron is a very brittle material. Iron's not very particularly strong. It will shatter and it will break. But if you add a very small percentage of carbon to iron, that's what makes steel. Again, steel is not an element. Steel is iron plus carbon. It's an alloy of an iron alloy. And this will relate to the use of pure copper versus pure copper by these reconstructions versus a historically accurate experiment would be using copper alloys, because again, ancients did not use pure copper, but neither did the ancients use pure iron, because when you're working in a furnace, so a tiny amount of carbon added to iron makes steel, and when you're working with steel, well, there's a lot of carbon just as part of the process of heating. Charcoal is carbon, and that gets added. So the Iron Age really is a steel age as well. And exactly when they realized to add the right amount of carbon to their iron to make steel, that could be debated, but accidentally at least, they're actually working with steel, not with iron, which is an important point, because a tiny amount of carbon in your steel, in your iron, makes steel. And comparing iron with steel, they're two different materials, and very, very different materials. So the same, you wouldn't use so in regards to these reconstructions, if I wanted to reconstruct a steel tool, I wouldn't use iron. In the same way, I wouldn't use pure copper to reconstruct ancient copper alloys such as arsenical copper / arsenical bronze. Might seem like a small thing, but these small amounts of these alloys, of these mixtures, makes a huge difference between a soft copper tool, as is described. The tool and the weapon is very different. It's two different things. So Ötzi's axe is not a copper axe, it's an arsenical copper axe. Makes a very, very big difference. There are many advantages to arsenical copper, and so so his so-called ancient copper axe really probably be better, more accurately described as a bronze axe. There was no pure copper back in those times, so modern reconstructions are using this very soft, pure copper, but again, that shouldn't be a comparison. The actual surviving ancient Egyptian chisels and wedges, they've been studied. They are not pure copper. Again, they are arsenical copper, maybe even arsenical bronze. Also, in regards to these reconstructions, especially as use, this is just a bad use of tool. If I was to work limestone with a steel chisel in the same way, it would bend as well. So steel is not a magical material compared to copper. If I were to use a better shaped tool, this would not be an issue. It would be using something more like this, or these problems in regards to the bending, again, it's very, I don't think it's a good reflection on the ancient tool experts, but also on the critics who use this as evidence, but it's just not evidence. It's not really anything. I'll again link in the description, but southern Sinai, so the copper used by the Egyptians, from the mines in the Sinai, they also have massive slag heaps. They were extracting huge amounts of copper from there. They also had them in the Western Desert, but the studies from the Sinai show, again, they are arsenic-rich copper. These are not soft copper tools. These are essentially bronze or arsenical copper, which makes a very big difference. So again, not copper. They are arsenical copper. The same way that iron is not steel, copper is not arsenical copper. They might even be arsenical bronze. Now, the difference between what's called arsenical copper and arsenical bronze is a definitional issue. But when you find copper ores, now malachite would be more green, but these are examples of copper-rich ores. They naturally contain, depending on the mine, will vary slightly, but arsenic or lead or even bismuth will be naturally in the ore, which makes it so you have an alloy, so whether it's bismuth or antimony or arsenic, that makes a copper alloy which is much better tool than pure copper. Archaeologists will define arsenical copper as, depends on so more than 1% arsenic by weight is defined as arsenical bronze because it is intentionally added. Less than 1%, actually less than 0.5%, is defined as arsenical copper because that arsenic may have been accidental. However, for instance, in the Iranian plateau, there's even evidence that they were making a arsenic-rich, like an iron arsenic mix, and they were selling that separately and trading that separately, so then it could then be added to the copper to make a bronze, which again, bronze has many, arsenical copper or arsenical bronze has many advantages. These ancient copper tools are not ancient copper tools. Arsenical copper or arsenical bronze was being used up until very recently, but whether it's Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek, not using copper. They were using an alloy, which is much different. The reason why we use pure copper now, pure copper wiring now, for instance, if I add 0.5% of weight of arsenic in copper, I reduce the conductivity by up to 1/3. This is why there's no interest in arsenical copper anymore, because we have other bronze alloys. But most often we use copper for wiring and to whether it's in computing or electrical transmission. That's where the main use of copper is. A very small impurity in modern copper makes it much less conductive. That's why people don't want to use it anymore. But up until very recently, it was still being used. For instance, the boilers in steam engines and steam trains, they specified arsenical copper. Firstly, because it makes it stronger in the casting, but it also makes it a stronger material. There's a higher tensile strength. It can also be work hardened to make it even harder. If you made a iron boiler, it would just, because of the pressure and the water, would rust it through. So that's why they specified arsenical copper or bronze. The ancient tools were again much harder. They also could be work hardened. If I take a piece of copper, pure copper even, and I beat it with a hammer on the edge, that will harden the edge. Arsenical copper or arsenical bronze, if I beat the edge, it hardens it even more. So these copper alloys can be work hardened. They become much stronger. This would also be an important feature in casting. So whether you're casting a bell, bronze bell, well, bronze is copper, just whether it's tin or whether it's arsenic, or cannons. If you cast bronze, copper, and you have arsenic added to it, it makes it a much stronger material as well. It also reduces granulation. So pure copper will granulate more. And now for instance, this is cast iron. And you can see when cast iron gets broken, you can see the little granules. It's not like the nice steel where you have that nice smooth polish, but when you cast, you tend to get these granules, and this also applies with bronze and copper. So this was another reason why arsenic was used in ancient times, and again up until quite recently. So arsenical copper, it is harder, it is stronger than pure copper. It can be work hardened more than pure copper. It makes a better tool, makes a better weapon. And when it comes to, so whether you're working stone or whether you're cutting timber, whatever you're using, there is a big difference, a very important difference in regards to that. Now that's all interesting because this actually will bring us back to these ancient gods of mining and metalworking and their depictions as being lame or short or dwarf or green-skinned as well. So having dealt with what ancient copper actually was and the ancient metalworking techniques, now let's look at these connections between green-skinned, dwarven and lame metalworking connections between the gods. So again, Egyptian chisels were not soft copper as we're familiar with. They're actually arsenical copper, maybe even arsenical bronze, depending on the percentage and the definitions between those two. In Mesopotamia, Their so-called soft copper was actually, again, arsenical copper and bronze. Also evidence that they understood how to make a arsenic compound, which with iron, that would also then be traded and added to copper elsewhere to make, again, a much harder material than pure copper. The Archaeum, for instance, and this ancient culture, so between 2800 to 2000 BC, this site and others have industrial scale furnaces, many furnaces, large ones. They were also engaged in mining operations and making and almost certainly trading over distance with arsenical bronze as well as being described. So the ancient world, no pure copper, they were using this arsenical copper or / arsenical bronze, and this is an important connection in regards to arsenic. Now, it also must be said, the so-called soft copper used tools in South America, Central America, were not pure copper either. The mines there, especially in Peru, are very arsenic rich, and so recent mining operations, they had to make a very large plant connected to this copper mine to remove the arsenic from the copper. A small amount of arsenic in copper wiring reduces the conductivity, the value of it significantly. So whether it's also, for instance, in Machu Picchu and other places, the so-called copper knives and tools they find there are actually bismuth copper alloys. Again, that's bronze. It's not pure soft copper as is often referred to. So the ancient metal workers and arsenic, and arsenical copper is maybe accidental. Arsenical bronze, more than 1% arsenic, is intentional, and we find this arsenical bronze across the ancient world. So it brings us back to the Greek god of metalworking and fire, Hephaestus, and his depiction as lame, just like Vulcan. And I'll link this article as well, but he's speaking about this as well. So Vulcan, muscly god, but also depicted with a limp. As we see in other parts of the world, this is probably the first known industrial disease, arsenic poisoning. The development of copper into the Bronze Age, and so the trouble with copper is that it was too soft, it wouldn't keep a sharp edge. For a cup, it would be great, useless for a sword. Early metalworkers found out if you beat the copper with a hammer, work hardened, it would become a little harder and so hold its edge longer, but it still didn't make very good swords. Then the metalworkers discovered if they added a small amount of arsenic to the copper during smelting, they got a bronze that was much harder, but they had to be exact, and that's one of the beauties of this Greek arsenical bronze. If you added more than 2.5% arsenic, the bronze becomes brittle. It actually becomes too hard. Now, this is an issue even with steel. If you harden steel too much, it will become brittle. Essentially, it will shatter. So that's why you don't get two hammers and hit them against one another, because they can shatter. And in the heat of battle, you want your sword to splinter just like glass. So these ancient metalworkers, just around the 2% mark was perfect. It was not too soft, but it was not too hard either, making so these so-called copper implements were actually bronze as well, arsenical bronze to be specific. And that was one of the reasons why if you have this in battle and your copper is now bronze, even though it's not the tin bronze that most would refer to, you have a huge advantage in regards to battle. So but it must be, whenever you hear the word harder in regards to stone or metals, please remember that this does not relate directly to Mohs hardness scale. This has become a trope, a meme, but it's just like way out of order. Really, it's not scientific. It's not truthful at all. And again, if you harden a metal, that does not directly relate to Mohs hardness scale either. The word harden can be used in different senses. Now, for instance, Jello, as Americans call it, or jelly. If I get jelly crystals from the packet and I rub them against my skin very hard, I'll scratch myself. But if I get jelly, if I make the jelly and then rub, it's the hardness is essentially the same on Mohs hardness scale, but the two materials, no one's going to say jelly is hard, but the crystals from which it is made are scratchy. But again, that's just one of the points. It's just become embedded itself into certain cultures, cults in regards to this talk. But arsenic poisoning, Hephaestus, Vulcan, lame. I'll link these papers as well where they've, for instance, arsenic poisoning. Arsenic's it's a poison, but what is technically nothing is poison. It's the dosage that makes something poisonous. Arsenic is actually a very important essential element that we need in our bodies to be healthy. You get small amounts of arsenic added to farm animals actually makes for a better animal as well in terms of growth, etc. But too much of it is very bad. Not enough arsenic in your body chemistry is also very bad. But one of the chronic arsenic poisoning causes peripheral neuritis with weakness and lameness of one or both extremities. So firstly, your one leg will grow longer than the other, as is there, but also something in regards to what's often called drop foot. Now, the tomb of Tutankhamun had this alabaster boat with a female dwarf, and she also had the club foot. So what's the proper? Anyway, drop foot, as it's generally referred to. This is also a side effect of chronic arsenic exposure. So where your foot just drops, it's you can't lift your foot up. That is also relates because we see this club foot or this drop foot in Scandinavian, North European gods of metalworking, such as Wayland. In Frank's casket in Northumbria, it's about the 8th century, but also the written description. Wayland the smith is hamstrung and kept as a slave by this evil king. Now, just like the Achilles tendon, if you ruin that tendon, your foot drops. You can't raise and lower your foot. So hamstrung could also be equated with drop foot, which again is a connection to arsenic poisoning, which is again so important in ancient metallurgy. Another side effect of arsenic poisoning is stunted growth. So for instance, they've been looking at Bangladesh. This would also apply to the e-waste trade, etc. But it stunts the growth. Now, dwarves such as this is a genetic issue. This is not an arsenic issue, but there could be an equation between short people from arsenic poisoning and dwarfism as well. But again, this type of dwarfism is genetic. It's not caused by arsenic poisoning, but that connection is still not too far away. Another side effect of arsenic poisoning is skin effects, dermatitis, but here we see where we get these green scales on people's hands. Your skin is turning green from arsenic exposure, which would be another nice link because these gods of the underworld, but especially Ptah and his metallurgical connections and the green skin. Also that copper/bronze turns green, and you can even see like the old sculptures of arsenical copper and bronze, how they turn green. Even malachite, the ore, one of the ores for copper is green. So that's, you can also make, they used to make a green pigment from arsenic and copper as well, but this is again one of these connections that could link all these things together. So metal workers, dwarves, lame skin, connecting to the ancient alchemy trade, where adding especially just the right amount of arsenic or adding arsenic to there, going back at least 4,500 years and these aspects. And so again, what's termed pure soft copper did not exist in the ancient world. They were actually be better off, well, arsenical bronze or arsenical copper, really just bronze is what it is. And it's a much different material. So ancient alchemy, arsenic and copper is part of the historical development. I think it's very important, like these small little details are actually, paint a much more relevant, appropriate picture of what was happening in the ancient past. with the so-called soft copper tools, which were not soft pure copper as we use now, they were good and appropriate and valuable tools to be using on stone, etc. Now even gem cutters, now we'll use a diamond tip saw, but not until very short time ago. Gem workers were using diamond is 10 on Mohs hardness scale. It's as hard as you can get on Mohs hardness scale, but gem workers used to use metal chisels to begin shaping the diamond. Then they would use diamond dust to polish the diamond and put the facets on it. But with a soft metal chisel, you can split diamond, which is 10 at the top of the scale. So again, Mohs hardness scale, it really has no business to be brought up. It's cringe, I'm sorry, and it's become embedded, but it's just not correct. So SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. I'll do a little bit, couple follow-ups on this. I'm also going to make a video where I've got samples of stone and copper and quartz, and I'm going to, just do the experiments, and you can see again this Mohs hardness scale thing just not right. But also in regards to some more aspects in regards to the metalworking gods, such as the Cyclops, griffins, and other connections again related to ancient texts. Arsenic, copper, bronze, it's actually part of, a very important part of our history. It's not, I don't believe it's not covered anywhere near hard enough. There are authors out there who speak on stoneworking and metal who surely must know this, and if not, then why not? They've been at it for decades, and without this aspect, you just not get, it's just not correct, and it's also diminishing our history. It's reducing the truth and the elements of it and the science of the past as well, which can actually be verified by the artifacts as well, as opposed to making stuff up in regards to that, or excluding very important information, essential information, and you really can't tell this part of history without these details. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. There's more to come on this, alchemy, metallurgists, and the ancient sciences. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.